Well, beat that, Sean Plunkett.
So,
Ladies and gentlemen, since we started this panel, we have been joined by a former NSA subcontractor whose disclosure of thousands of documents revealed the scale of global surveillance on a level never imagined before, generating global indignation over the theft of individual privacy under the pretense of national security. Without Edward Snowden, the world may not have learned the extent of NSA and Five Eyes international surveillance, including PRISM. Edward Snowden has been the recipient of numerous awards in recognition of his efforts as an internationally recognised whistleblower to promote transparency and accountability in government. Please, whānau, welcome Edward Snowden.
Hello, New Zealand. I'm not used to this kind of welcome.
And Ed, I've got to tell you that we're in the Auckland Town Hall at the Democratic Centre of the biggest city in New Zealand. We have a packed hall. There are 800 people who have not been able to get in tonight. They wanted to hear you. We owe you our gratitude. Thank you from Aotearoa.
Woo! Thank you.
And now I think your old mate Glenn has a few questions to ask you.
I do. The journalist in me will never die, and when I see Edward Snowden, I need to start asking questions.
If I could actually get one thing in there, I just want to point out, it was interesting that you said the town hall event's taking place in Auckland, because we're talking about mass surveillance, we're talking about everything that's going on, and the fact that the Prime Minister has denied that there is no mass surveillance in New Zealand, that these are only cyber protection programs, and even though they were contemplating them, they never went forward. He heroically put a stop to this at the 11th hour, and none of us know what's going on. But you know, there are actually NSA facilities in New Zealand that the GCSB is aware of, and that means the Prime Minister is aware of, and one of them is in Auckland. Another one is in the north of the country, but I'll leave it there. Glenn, please go ahead.
Yeah, so... Well, it's a great place to start because, as I think everybody knows, you have created a little bit of a stir over the last year and 2 months around the world. But you have specifically created a stir here in New Zealand with the article that you wrote over the last several days for The Intercept that was published just a couple of hours before we convened here, in which you made some very strong statements about the ongoing evolving debate taking place here in New Zealand, including your statement that for multiple reasons, Prime Minister Key's claims about the GCSB not participating in mass surveillance, New Zealanders not being subjected to mass surveillance are, as you called them, false statements. Could you talk about, based on your own personal experience working within the NSA and the Five Eyes infrastructure, what your basis is for those conclusions?
Right, absolutely. I think one of the key things to get out in the beginning is to say, when the Prime Minister is making these statements about there is no mass surveillance, people can disagree about what this is, what it's not. You're always entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. When the bulk collection of private citizens' communications, emails, text messages, location data, metadata, calling records, what you order online, what you buy, who you talk to, who you love, what you do, when these things are collected by any arm of government without an individualized, particularized suspicion of wrongdoing, on the individual level, that is a violation not just of rights on the national level, but of human rights that are not given to us by government, but are inherent to our nature. And so when he says this isn't occurring, I think what's happening. Thank you. I think what's happening is a careful parsing of words. He's saying this isn't mass surveillance, even though, you know, GCSB is collecting all of your information, they're sharing it with NSA. NSA is doing it and then providing that same information to us, so we don't have to do it domestically. We don't have to collect it domestically. We just get to search their copies of our citizens' data. He's saying it's not surveillance because as long as, you know, in these trillions of records that are collected, not every single record is read by a human being when they come in the morning like it's email. But even that is not entirely true, and it's inaccurate in many ways. So when I worked at the NSA, my last position was as an infrastructure analyst. You can think of it as sort of a state-sponsored hacker, where what you do is you look at network infrastructure, you look at routers, you look at all the connection points, you look at companies, and you look at targets around the world, and you figure out how their networks work, how they fit together, and how to break into them. You're basically sort of a burglar casing the joint. That was when I realized the absolute scale of how deep this went. Because when I was doing this, I would see the communications of individuals from around the world. I could be looking at a system in Japan. I could be looking at a system in Germany. I could be looking at a system in New Zealand. And what was incredible was the fact that I could see records of the communications of people around the world from every country comprehensively. The way it works is X key score is what you can think of as a sort of a, in technical terms, a federated search system. What it means is the NSA, along with the Five Eyes sort of alliance, which includes New Zealand as a significant part of it, to put a system of sensors around the world. You can think of these as tapping devices. Some of them are cable taps. Some of them are well, what's been reported are cable taps so far, so let's leave it there. But there's a network of sensors around the world where it's racks of equipment. They don't have to be at telecommunications providers. The Southern Cross gentleman said, there's no way this could happen. You know, we would know if it happened. We would see it. We would have evidence of it. We would have to be complicit with the government. There's no way to tap a fiber optic cable without us knowing about it and without it taking our cable down. But we've seen over the last year, the NSA has done this around the world in countries that we're allied with and countries that we're not. So I would have to ask that gentleman, what makes your company unique out of every telecommunications provider in the world that you would know when the GCSB, when the NSA are tapping your lines and no one else can? But the key is you've got this network of sensors around the world, and then I, sitting at the NSA in Hawaii, come in the morning, I type in my search. I look for, let's say I want to read John Key's email. I enter his email address, and it sends that search to every one of these sensor networks around the world. And they search their local database of metadata and content. The content of all communications that pass through these sites is held for about 3 to 5 days, depending on the storage, and it's constantly going back further and further in time as we gain more capability. So I can see everything. I can see what book you looked at Amazon.com, you know, last week. I can see who you talked to. I can see who your friends on Facebook are. I can see the text messages you sent. I can read the emails you wrote. And I can set up things that are called fingerprints that allow me to track where you've been on the web, who you're talking to, even if you're using sort of anonymizing technology and so forth. Now, what's interesting about these sensor networks is when I'm typing in this search for an email address, I say where in the world, which of these sensors I want it to go to. And I know that there's mass surveillance happening in New Zealand because one of those checkboxes, one of those sensor networks, is in New Zealand. So when John Key or anyone in the New Zealand government says there is no mass surveillance in New Zealand, and they wave cyber protection programs around or whatever they want to call it, they talk about Project Cortex, they're distracting from the main question. When a journalist hears, you know, oh, there's no mass surveillance in New Zealand, they need to follow up, they need to press, and they need to say, Mr. Prime Minister, what about X key score? What about the GCSB's involvement in X key score? What about New Zealand's involvement in the X key score mass surveillance program? And to this day, he said, I won't talk about this. I won't talk about this because it's related to foreign intelligence. But is it related to foreign intelligence if it's collecting the communications of every man, woman, and child in the country of New Zealand? And you know, maybe the people of New Zealand think that's appropriate. Maybe they think that they want to sacrifice a certain measure of their liberty and say, it's okay if the government watches me, I'm concerned about terrorism, I'm concerned about foreign threats. We can have, you know, people in every country make that decision because that's what democracy is about. That's what self-government is about. But that decision doesn't belong to John Key or officials in the GCSB making these decisions behind closed door without public debate, without public consent. That decision belongs exclusively to the people of that country. And I think it's wrong of him. And I think it's wrong of him, I think it's wrong of any politician to take away the public's seat at the table of government and say, you'll simply have to trust us. And you know what? It's not in the public interest to know about these programs, unless it threatens my reputation, and then I'm going to throw classified documents in the air like I'm Julian Assange. No offense, though, Julian.
So Ed, if I could, just to be very clear about one particular point, can you say definitively, based on your firsthand work with X-Keyscore and other mass surveillance programs, that within the Five Eyes Alliance mechanisms, there are large amounts of indiscriminate metadata about the communication and other online events of New Zealand citizens? And does the GCSB, separately as a question, contribute in any way, analytically or otherwise, to that collection of data?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. There's not just metadata, although people like to talk about just metadata, and metadata is extraordinarily intrusive. As an analyst, I would prefer to be looking at metadata than looking at content because it's quicker and easier and it doesn't lie. If I'm listening to your phone call, you can try to talk around things, you can use code words, but if I'm looking at your metadata, I know which number called which number. I know which computer talked to which computer. And yeah, that exists comprehensively for all of the Five Eyes allies, for all of their network-enabled sort of partners, for all of their telecommunications providers and things like that that are overseas that have a strong national connection. They create sort of what they call commercial relationships, corporate relationships that allow them to do this. And specifically, yes, the GCSB not only uses X-Keyscore, they have expanded it. They've contributed to its development. They've proposed algorithms and those sort of fingerprints that are used to track people and targets. And that's a tremendously concerning thing for any public, particularly when these decisions about whether or not intelligence agencies should cross the gap between targeted surveillance based on judicial warrants, based on limited collection that's necessary and proportionate to the threat faced, and sort of leaving the intelligence agencies to their own devices and say, hey, if you guys want to watch everybody in the country, that's fine. Just tell us what you want to do and you'll pass the law, or we'll pass the law for you. And I think that's another key. We talk about this GCSB Act of sort of August of last year, and we go, if the Prime Minister is so comfortable revealing this information this week, why didn't this happen last year when it was being debated? Why was it not relevant to the public interest when it was our rights on the line? But suddenly it's critical to get this information out there when it's one man's reputation on the line. And that's a question that I think needs to be answered.
Yeah, well, I think it was good to
But to just clarify on that, X-Keyscore does involve both the metadata and content collection for individuals in New Zealand. That's without question. Citizens of New Zealand have their private communications in this database, and people in the GCSB, people in the NSA, people at the Canadian CSEC, people at GCHQ, in the UK and DSD in Australia, they all have access to these communications. And while they are theoretically constrained by policy, and I do believe they try to use these policies appropriately to manage them, they aren't really overseen. We don't know what they're doing. It happens in the dark without any accountability and without any public say in how these programs are operated or if they should exist at all. And it's very concerning when a foreign intelligence agency like the National Security Agency can propose a law to be put in place in New Zealand for the GCSB, which is the August law that was passed last year. And the GCSB can start basically proposing programs that are unlawful at the time they're being considered and say, hey, pass a law to make this legal, and we're going to go ahead and put this out here immediately. Why are they considering programs that are not legal? You know, these are things that the public has not just the right to know, but the responsibility to know, because how can the government have the consent of the governed if they don't know what's going on? You know, consent has to be informed to be meaningful, and I think that is the problem that we're seeing in New Zealand today. It doesn't matter necessarily if there's mass surveillance in New Zealand, if the people said that's what they want. But for it to have been concealed, and for the highest officials in government to have been party of that, and now to be changing their story day after day after day about what they knew, when they knew, and why it happened, this should cause everybody to be asking questions, not just about, you know, what's going to come out next, what are we going to learn, you know, what have we been lied about, but more importantly, what are we going to do about it? The reality is, everyone in New Zealand's private communications are only protected by a single checkbox, a checkbox that says, please don't show me results from people in New Zealand. And that does exist in X-Keyscore. You know, these intelligence services do have the opportunity to say, I don't want to see this. But after you run one search and you don't get the results you like, you uncheck the box and you're allowed to then see everything. So the question becomes, is it right for our governments to have the opportunity to know everything about us, even if we're not suspected of any wrongdoing, to collect everything about the most private details, the most intimate details of our lives, without us having any knowledge of it, without us having any say over it, without us having a vote on it, and then to play politics with it, but when it becomes a matter of public interest? And I don't know what the answer is. I'm not from New Zealand. I'm not going to back any parties. This is for every individual citizen in every individual place to decide the kind of societies they want to live in. But if the government is checking boxes off about our lives and how we're going to live, I think election time is when we get the opportunity to check boxes about them. Woo! And in New Zealand, that's coming very soon.
Are you going to go to Julian? Okay. But you're going to go to Julian.